joining a very old and prestigious newspaper title with a brand new media forum, which is digital radio, to expand the family. So I think we see ourselves very much as sort of a sister of the Times newspaper, very much related, pooling some editorial resources in terms of having an extraordinary access to their huge array of brilliant journalistic talent, but while very much doing our own thing and following the news cycle as we like. And I still love print. I'm still writing for The Sun, various amounts of columns a year, which is great. I'm delighted to do that. I suppose it's something new and extremely exciting. John Pienaar puts this really well. He's another of our Times Radio presenters. And he said he's been lucky to be at the birth of two brand new media ventures in his time. One is Times Radio, and the other one was the Independent newspaper when it launched in mid-80s, 86 I think it was. And to be at the start of something is absolutely fantastic. And I don't really see it too much as leaving print and joining broadcast, as still doing a bit of everything. I'll still be writing, I'll be doing broadcasts, which I've done, I suppose, more and more over the years and enjoyed it more and more. But crucially, I get to bang on about politics all the time. I get to talk about politics incessantly, throughout the day on the various different programs. I'll be coming on and off different shows from breakfast in the morning till sort of late at night on whatever the news is, obviously down here, to a show on Sunday morning, which I'm hosting with Gloria De Piero, a 3-hour sort of flagship political show, I think they call it, to compete with the likes of Andrew Marr and Sophie Ridge. So, I mean, it really is a dream job. Without sounding too much of a cliche, I could struggle to tailor make a job that I'd enjoy more.
Yes, you'll literally be doing a bit of everything. Sounds fun.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's not that different then in a way to the pace of a daily newspaper and online that you're used to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to recalibrate my days as we speak, actually. But on print, I was in print for over 20 years, 23, 24 years. And you are very much a slave to the deadline. Clearly that changed a bit with the advent of digital, and we could put stories up online and break them wherever we had them. But you'd still really, your goal was really, the evening deadlines, 6, 7 p.m. I was notoriously late at filing copy. Everyone on the Sun backbench will tell you that. So, maybe at 8 o'clock at night. But it was all about, the first edition on the street at 10:30ish, and everything in the day really led to that. You'd want to file obviously in time, but find out your information in time, and then the print day, various conferences with the editor throughout the day. Radio is obviously completely different in that it's 24 hours, and you therefore need to. It's exactly the same story. Interesting. There's absolutely nothing different I'll be covering for Times Radio than I have been covering for The Sun. Down here in Westminster, in the Hogwarts Palace. But I'm just regurgitating it in a different fashion. So radio, I need to say something different on the breakfast show at 7:05 in the morning as I might on to John Pienaar at sort of 6 o'clock at night. And it's the same information, and it's how you use it that's a fascinating new art that I'm trying to learn as we speak.
Mm. And so just looking briefly back at your time at The Sun before we move forward, quite simply, what are you most proud of from your time there?
God, I did so much. I was so blessed with having such an extraordinary. I arrived as defence editor in 2004, having just covered the Iraq War as the Mirror's defence man. So covered the rest of the Iraq War as it really was until 2009, and then the start of what certainly became the Afghan War with British troops going to Helmand province down in the south in 2006. So I sort of had two wars simultaneously going on to cover for The Sun, spent huge amounts of time out there, which was an extraordinary experience, and then moved down to Westminster in 2009 for the tail end of Gordon Brown's administration, and obviously the beginning of David Cameron's, which was the coalition years, then obviously a brief respite of about a year of majority government under David Cameron, and then into the EU referendum cycle and Brexit and all the extraordinary psychodramas going on both in the Tories and Labour and the Lib Dems. The SNP is the only one constant really throughout all this. We did have a Scottish referendum as well. So it's been, it's been the most extraordinary period, first in defence, then in politics, and it's unbelievably privileged to get that ringside seat on. So it's kind of tough to pick. I suppose in terms of the impact that we might have had as a paper, and I might have had as a helping all that, it's probably Help for Heroes. I mean, that's the one thing I think I can actively point to in all the yards of copy I've filed over the years. Help for Heroes was a tiny military charity in 2007 when it started. It was basically 2 people and a dog, and Jeremy Clarkson, which kind of helped them. But Jeremy and Francie Clarkson, his wife at the time, approached us and said, can you help us turn this tin pot thing into a charity that we want to raise 8 million quid to build a swimming pool for wounded troops. And it was, the zeitgeist at the time was British troops fighting and dying for their country in 2 different wars, and no one back home knowing a huge amount about it and certainly caring a lot less. And with Help for Heroes, it wasn't just raising upwards of £300 million and counting as we speak, because I still do sort of bike rides for them and try and help them where I can. But it was putting troops on the map in terms of people understanding what they're doing, not sympathising as such, but sort of empathising and respecting their work and their sacrifice without necessarily having to agree with the politics of why they were there. And that was sort of so important about it. And we had real impact. We built them their swimming pool. We then went on to help them build a massive brand new rehabilitation centre, in fact 4 or 5 around the country. And we could see tangibly the difference. And I think that was a great experience. The thing about papers and all media is that it's very live for the day, the story of the day, you move on to the next one, you move on to the next one, and the pace is so fast. It's often hard to see any impact you might be having, and you may be having no impact at all. And that's probably the way it should be, because you're there to inform and not do anything else. So when you have a chance to help create something and help change people's lives, as all that money ended up doing, it's really an incredible privilege, and quite special really, because that's not really what we're supposed to be doing. But it's great if you can get a chance. That's a very long-winded answer, but I hope you get the gist of it.
Very lovely answer, actually. Yeah, that's really nice. And then just as well, 16 years at the Sun, sort of the tabloid culture has changed so much in that time. Yeah. From within the newsroom, how have you seen sort of, I guess, the main changes and what's for the better and what's for the worse?
Well, I mean, you're right about the change. It's extraordinary, the pace of what we did then. But to be honest, I think the change was already underway by the time I arrived. The editor at the time was Rebecca Brooks, who was a very different editor to some of her predecessors. Certainly led the sort of campaigning journalism that Help for Heroes and many other campaigns ended up being. So it was tabloid journalism with more of a heart, I think, and more of a conscience. And that was very much changed, been underway for a while. And I think that's accentuated as time has gone on. There are a lot of different social things that, thankfully, the Sun does not talk about anymore, and certainly doesn't argue for. In the past, 20 years ago, we were outing gay politicians, and that's unthinkable that anyone would do that these days, and thank God as well. So that's all changed a lot. We had page 3 when I first joined the Sun, and that was dispensed with a while back now, 5-6 years ago, I think. And I think it was a general feeling that that well past his sell-by date as well. So, like everything, a good newspaper does move with the times. It reflects the thoughts and feelings and sentiments of its readers. If it wants to be successful, it should do anyway. And it should be no surprise that newspapers evolve as their readers and society evolves with it.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely lots of good stuff going on. I wondered how you find it. There's sort of, and whether this is accurate at all, obviously, but I think there's a perception that your politics are often slightly further to the left than the Sun itself, and maybe more sympathetic to the EU on Twitter. So sort of, is that right? And if so, sort of, did you find that challenging and sort of having, the narrative of the newspaper, I suppose?
Not at all. I mean, I have some sort of politics. I've never tried to declare them. To be honest, I'm not sure I fully understand them myself. I've never been party affiliated. I don't associate myself with the left or the right. I've got great sympathy for a lot of causes on the right and the left, and a lot of antipathy for both as well. So I'm not a very easy person to pigeonhole when it comes to politics. I think you can get if you tweet something, you tweet. I very rarely tweet views. I might try and talk about whether it's on Twitter or broadcast or whatever. I try and point things out, things I think are interesting and worth pointing out. And if it's an inconsistency to whatever the policy the government is pushing at the time, which may or may not be about Brexit, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm anti-Brexit or pro-EU. And I think there was for a while, and I think it's passing on now, thank God, but there was a culture where unless you were slavishly pro one cause or other in the referendum debate and tweeted precisely that as well, then somehow you were an active participant for the other side. And that was always wrong. It was the polarization of the entire country there. It wasn't just, the Westminster bubble and what we might say about each other. But that is basically what Times Radio is all about. It's getting back to a stage where you can have a civilized conversation, you can be intelligent and informed without necessarily having to take a side and without being adversarial. So I think, if this is not too much a political answer, it's possible some of my tweeting and my content was misinterpreted, but it was at no stage ever intended to fly a flag for any cause whatsoever, because I generally have extremely few of them.
No, that makes complete sense, and it's interesting you've just tied it in with Times Radio, because what I was going to say next was, well, yeah, very, very pro. They've been teaching you well.
Thank you very much.
What I was going to say was obviously Times Radio, you'll have to follow more Ofcom guidelines, be more impartial, etc. Whereas the Sun is very much, this is what the Sun thinks. And do you think that will be a challenging change for you to change how you're putting that out there, if you see what I mean? Yeah,
I mean, I think look, Ofcom, and there are the legal guidelines and the codes of conduct for broadcast are different to print. There's no two ways about it. And I wouldn't change either, quite frankly. I think it's brilliant that we've got such a robust, healthy, loud, sometimes aggressive print media, because that's precisely what, you need to hold power to account. But what I think that the journalism I've always done on the Sun, and I would say the same about all my print colleagues, from the Sun, the Mirror, the Star to the Telegraph Times and FT, is that actually, certainly in the lobby and political journalism, we almost always report the same stories. I've never reported politically from a particularly, politically biased point of view, and I've been, lucky to work for 5 different editors on the Sun who have never ever, and I can tell you this hand on heart, ever said, here's the story, I want you to write it like this. Not one of them has in 11 years of being political editor. They've always said, what do you think the story of the day is? What's the best line on this, that, or whatever it may be? Great, in which case, file it like that. And I think it's really important to differentiate the editorial line of any newspaper, as in what the newspaper believes in its leader columns, to the reporting line. And you can report very faithfully, and as what I think the Sun always tries to do on the story of the day politically, on what is actually happening, the facts as we see them and the facts as they're relevant to our readers, without at all having to fly the paper's particular politics. And again, that's often misunderstood. And I think people might pick up the paper, maybe see a headline, read the leader, and decide without actually reading the stories, which is quite a common occurrence in that world. And realize actually, if you did read all the stories, it's pretty faithful reporting, throughout, which you could find, quite comfortably sitting in the pages of the Times or the FT or even the Guardian, really.
Do you think stuff like that has increased with social media and people just seeing a headline and sharing it, and then so many people sharing it without actually reading all the stories?
I think there's a bit of that. Social media probably accentuates some of the unfortunate cultures of society. The Twitter lynch mobs of this world. I mean, often you can tweet something and headline to a story or the introduction, the intro, and people will jump all over it and say, "Aha! But you didn't say this or that." And actually, you click the link, you'll find you do in the copy in full, and you give the other person's point of view. And that's something we always do, or we always used to do on the Sun. You always have the other person's point of view in the story as well. But I think it's wrong to blame all this on social media. That Britain, for generations, centuries probably, has obsessed over newspapers and newspaper readership. And it's something to do with a slight class obsession, which I think is beginning to go. I pray is beginning to go. But you know, it was a really big thing what paper you read, and it delineated you as a certain type of person with a certain type of, you might live in a certain place or not do a certain type of job. And it's a horrendous snobbery, quite frankly. It's always appalled me. And I think all papers, not just the Sun, but every paper, you know, has a very unfair stereotype of it, largely formed by people, potentially class-based or potentially not, who really know absolutely nothing about the paper and almost certainly never read it. And that's been around for an awful long time, and you can't blame social media for that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's definitely a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to just blame social media for stuff at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, rightly sometimes, because it's a pretty terrible beast, and the fact you can have, you know, lynch mobs tearing people or ideas or viewpoints apart for the sake of it is quite unappealing. But you know, Twitter is, if you like, it's a medium for some pretty bad vibes and feelings rather than the problem in itself. You know, it is how people who've got issues portray themselves and demonstrate those issues is not the issue itself, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. Cool. So just going back to Times Radio,
yeah,
sort of, how do you see its position in, I guess, the media market at the moment? Like, do you think you're trying to take on Radio 4?
I think we're trying to take on any type of speech radio that covers current affairs, that we think we could do it in a slightly different way. So Radio 4 is a very good example of a station we might be trying to take on, but then, you know, so is 5 Live, so is, you know, LBC. Interestingly, the list runs out there, and that's the fascinating thing about, you know, current affairs speech radio in Britain. I mean, there are very, very few of them, and in terms of what I think we're trying to do, you know, serious, intelligent, you know, witty, maybe informed type of radio, current affairs broadcasting, you know, across the whole schedule, 24 hours a day, that really doesn't exist almost anywhere. I mean, you know, look at Radio 4, and, you know, which has some great products on it. And, you know, I've done a lot of BBC Radio 4 broadcasting as well. I was, you know, the host for Week in Westminster for many years, or one of the hosts. So, you know, I wouldn't want to detract from them at all. But if you want to find some current affairs in the middle of the afternoon, there is a good chance you could turn on Radio 4 and find the afternoon play, and have to wait for that to be over. But I think there is the almost unique format of sort of 24-hour current affairs, how we want to cover it. But there's also the tone, where I think we really do want to be different, and I think we can be different. Every radio station has always struck me as like a person. Every radio station has a personality, and you know the personality of Radio 4, you know the personality of LBC, Talk Radio, etc. And I think we are going to be a different personality, less adversarial. We want less fighting, less journalism that makes the listener rather feel, you know, possibly uncomfortable at hearing ding-dongs every morning, afternoon or evening, and more of a forum to tease out the interesting parts of the debate in a way that's perhaps a little bit warmer. I think the tone as well as the content, simply engaging with every single issue there possibly is, politics or otherwise, in an intelligent, maybe a little more light-hearted, but certainly more relaxed forum, warmth, I think would sum it up, does appear to us to have space for in the market. You know, we think there is a gap offered by the rather small current choice available. You know, there really aren't many of these sorts of stations around. So giving people the choice of coming to a different one that might do things just a little bit differently, more light, less fight, is probably the best way to sum it up. It is really what we're trying to achieve. And all of us coming onto the station are totally enthused that there is that gap there. There are an awful lot of people who might want that and might want to try that. And it's an incredible, I mean, this sounds awfully corny, I know, but it's an extraordinary coming together of like-minded people. Every single one of the presenters and all of the production staff, well, who are, by the way, utterly brilliant. The caliber of people that we've got as producers and assistant producers is amazing. So I'm going on a bit now, but I've just been on the phone to someone who we hired out of Newsnight, we've hired out of Today programme in the morning, we've hired out of LBC. I mean, they're top quality people, which is such a joy to be working with such extraordinary professionals. Many of them I come across, in previous guises when they were working for the Today programme or something. But we all have that same ethos. We all share that same sort of feeling of we can do things really interestingly, differently, with a little bit less conflict and perhaps a bit more warmth. And it's an extraordinary feeling to be working on something with such a defining characteristic and goal we're all trying to achieve. And also, for the first time all together, it's generally incredibly exciting.
Just on the point about being less adversarial and less conflict, say if you're interviewing a politician who's not answering your questions and that there should be something they are able to say or whatever. Yeah. How hard will you push them? Like, how will you hold back to keep the tone warmer? What are you going to do?
No, I don't think so at all. So you can be less adversarial, but just as challenging, I think is a way of putting it. So you'll find out shortly, hopefully, but there is absolutely no intention to get anybody an easy ride. It will be thoroughly challenging and thoroughly engaging, but I think you can do that in a way that's intelligent and sounds less adversarial. So, for example, every politician I've ever interviewed, you almost always get more out of them by being nice to them, having a human conversation with them, and it relaxes them, and they end up opening up a little bit more. And if we've got some pretty strong questions we want to answer, you can point out the fact they just simply haven't answered that without necessarily interrupting them 15 times in one sentence, and without, metaphorically clubbing them over the head. So, there are ways of doing all these things. It doesn't mean at all you're prepared to go soft on people. You're just prepared to, go at them in just a slightly more subtle way, perhaps.
Okay, well, I'm sure the politicians will be thrilled to know.
Well, not as the case may be when they turn and tell us what they didn't intend to. But let's see if this one works.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe just a couple of brief questions. Just thought it'd be interesting to hear your views on how the government's sort of media and comm strategy during the pandemic has been going.
Yeah.
We've heard a fair bit of criticism from journalists. What's your view on how they've been doing with it?
Yeah, I think there's been ups and downs, is the honest way to say it. I'd start by saying they have an extraordinarily difficult job on their hands, and there is no playbook how to deal with a coronavirus pandemic. There is no manual. You can say, well, this is what you do for the comms for it. I mean, they really have to and it's no offence to say make it up every single day with a new chapter, which is extremely hard work, and it would tax any government, and it is taxing every government around the world. So I suppose I have possibly a degree of sympathy that isn't necessarily shared by some of my colleagues for the plight and the difficulty the government have, and I think maybe that's we could reflect that a bit more on Times Radio. But that said, I think it comes in fits and starts. I think the advent of daily press conferences was a really important idea because it allowed them to open themselves up to us and to talk to us about what it is that they think is important and to give us a chance to talk to them. And that took some ironing out, whether we were allowed to follow up our questions as we would be normally in press conferences. That didn't originally happen. We had to fight for that. Those have been withdrawn now, which may not be a bad thing really, because I think they might have served their time in terms of the interest and as worthwhile events. And undoubtedly there were moments when the government could have elucidated what they were trying to say better, and they could have thought it through better. I think the initial unveiling of the roadmap was, I think everyone agreed, was not ideal at all. The messaging was confusing. And at times they've struggled, but at times they're very strong. I mean, look at the messaging they had for the lockdown itself. And you can argue whether it was done in time or not. A lot of people think it was too late, but when they did it, it was extremely powerful, and they got their comms. They were almost too successful, as I think some would admit now, because they ended up with most people we want to leave their house, even when the government said, "Please, can you now leave your house and go back to work?" The reception was pretty poor to that. So it fits and starts, but I'm not unsympathetic to the challenge, is I think how I'd put it.
And just on the other side of things as well, in terms of how the journalists have been doing, one of the elements is sort of should more health and science journalists have been at the briefings instead of political journalists, etc. What do you think about that?
I think that's a fair point, but it's good to see quite a lot of them there now. I think political journalism, like all of this, like everyone who's got anything to do with this pandemic, has been on a little bit of a learning curve as well. And I think a lot of political journalists, certainly I, thought it was quite easy to be an expert on the science quite quickly. You could do a bit of cramming up on the R rate, and suddenly you can interpret the figures all on your own, and you really can't. This is fiendishly complicated stuff. And the thing about political journalists, lobby journalists, is we're really generalists. Everyone might call us political experts, and maybe we might be on politics. But if you look at the vast array of subject matter politics covers, it's everything from defence of the realm to security to health to education to transport. Everything the government does has some impact on everybody's lives, and you can't be an expert in all that. And I think we learned that I think reasonably early on, that it was actually far better to put up Hugh Pym possibly than Laura, as brilliant as Laura is, or ditto on ITV. And we've had all manner of different Sun journalists go on to ask questions for us as well. So I think that's a completely fair point.
And just more generally over the past year, even before the pandemic, there was sort of increasing debate among journalists about the use of anonymous number 10 sources. And whether, what's your view on that debate?
It's difficult because the number 10 source, the infamous number 10 source, turned into a little bit of a cliche. And I think after a while I started to vary that to a Downing Street source or a Whitehall source, simply because number 10 source sounded so awful. I would, however, defend the concept, because there is a lot that happens in politics in the grey area. There is a lot that politicians want to say, whether they're in Downing Street or in the House of Commons as MPs, that they may not necessarily want to say on the record, but is still thoroughly worth reporting. The idea that if they don't say it on the record, then it's somehow disingenuous or wrong, it really isn't true. Politicians go a lot further off the record. People in Downing Street can as well. And if someone in Downing Street is saying something, even if they have to be known as a number 10 source, then quite frankly, it really should be reportable. I mean, these are the people, the very people running the country at the very top of the pile. And I think readers and listeners have got a right to know what they're thinking. You may passionately disagree with it, and you may try and shoot the messenger repeatedly. When Laura Koonsberg, for example, a good friend of mine, has done that. She's faithfully reported what a number 10 source has told her. She has been piled in on by people largely on social media who somehow think she's committing a heinous sin by simply reporting what someone has told her. I mean, she is carrying out basic fundamental, source of journalism, as indeed we all are when we do that as well. So to shoot the messengers for faithfully doing their jobs, I think is pretty ugly, and it's depressing it happens. But there is a really good reason why you want to do it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean my automatic light has gone off. They do that in here to save money, taxpayer money, and so they should. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to trust everything number 10 source and believe it wholeheartedly. You report it, I think we all do, with caveats. Well, this is what number 10 source says, and this is what a Labour MP or the opposition might necessarily say. So as long as you don't report it as, wholesome fact, but it is still a hugely important part of the political debate.
Great, yeah, thank you for sharing your views on that. I thought we would just wrap up with just tell us your show and your part on Times Radio in like 30 seconds or less.
Yes, okay, I'll try and keep this one short, unlike the rest of them. So I'm the station's chief political commentator, and I'm also a presenter of the Sunday morning flagship political show with the very recently former Labour MP called Gloria De Piero, and therefore our show is called G&T, which is going to be really, really interesting. It's a Sunday morning political show, 10 a.m. till 1 p.m, with a bit of a difference. Different types of guests, still sort of, the big hitters from the government, the opposition you'd expect, but we're coming at it from a slightly different take, slightly outside of the bubble take, that I hope is going to really appeal. And the chief political commentator role sort of sells itself, really. Times Radio's man in Westminster reporting and analysing what's happening day by day and hour by hour.